The weapon that destroyed Halcyon Station was called a resonance disruptor, a device the Karrath Dominion had spent 8 years and a significant fraction of their industrial output building. It could selectively collapse the molecular cohesion of specific materials while leaving others untouched. At the settings used for this operation, it distinguished between structural composite and human biology, targeting the former with a precision that left the latter unharmed, briefly, just long enough for the structure to fail catastrophically around it. In Karrath engineering terminology, it was a clean weapon. Halcyon Station housed 2,300 people. The majority were researchers attached to an interstellar cartographic survey that had been operating out of its labs for 11 years. The station had no weapons. Its defenses consisted of collision avoidance systems, a standard civilian distress beacon, and a security team of 12 whose primary function was managing equipment theft. The first pulse hit at 0499 during the shift change when the station's population was most distributed across its corridors. Dr. Layla Nasser, a cartographic analyst, had been in the cafeteria getting coffee when the structure around her began to groan. She described the sound afterward as what buildings make when they settle, except continuous and accelerating. The wall to her left cracked horizontally. Then again, the composite panels separating from their fasteners, not because of explosive force, but because the fasteners, aluminum alloy, a different molecular weight than the panels, were simply no longer there. The second pulse hit 47 seconds later. 847 people died in those 2 pulses and the structural collapses that followed. 1,453 were evacuated by emergency response teams working from adjacent survey vessels, operating for 9 hours in what had become a slow-motion demolition as the station continued to degrade around them. The Karrath military broadcast recordings of both pulses on their internal command network within the hour, classified to senior commanders but not to the classification level that blocked 4 Terran intelligence assets who had penetration of that network. Those 4 assets received the recordings at the same time Karrath generals did. The Karrath follow-up communication reached the Terran Council 6 hours later, delivered through the standard diplomatic channel as if it were a routine message. It outlined, in the formal language of interstellar negotiation, a position. The station's destruction demonstrated a capability that made the existing border arrangement between the Karrath and the Accord untenable, and the Karrath proposed a revision of those terms to reflect the new strategic reality. The Council had been in continuous emergency session for those 6 hours. General Toval had been in the chamber for 3 of them, waiting. When the Karrath message arrived, Counselor Adela Navarro looked across the table and asked what he knew. He opened a folder. "We've been monitoring the Karrath weapon program for 2 years," he said. "We knew the capability was coming. We had a projected operational date within a 4-month window." A pause. "The attack today fell within that window." The chamber was very quiet. "We knew," he said. And Halcyon Station's civilian director knew. Director Yuna Adler was briefed on the risk 12 days ago. She made a decision. He closed the folder. So did we. Director Yuna Adler's final message to her family ran 7 minutes and 43 seconds. The Council heard it 3 days after her death, in the same chamber where they had been briefed on her decision. She had recorded it at her desk in Halcyon Station's administrative section 3 days before the first pulse. The desk was organized the way a person's desk is organized when they have tidied it with the specific care of someone who may not return to it. Through the viewport behind her, the station's solar array was visible against the dark. She did not say goodbye. She described the situation with the precision of a scientist. What the intelligence assessment contained, what the decision required, what she had concluded. She described what she believed would follow the attack, the response it would enable, the wider conflict it might prevent, in language that was careful and certain, and neither resigned nor afraid. At the end of the message, she said, "Tell them I hope they make sure." The chamber was silent for a long time after the recording ended. "Make sure," Counselor Navarro said finally. "Operation First and Last," said Admiral Kieran Marsh, who had been sitting at the far end of the table saying nothing. She knew the operation's name. She was told what it would do if she gave us what we needed. He paused. She gave us what we needed. The intelligence penetration of the Karrath weapon program had cost 3 field operatives their covers and 1 their life. What it produced across 2 years was a complete technical picture of the resonance disruptor, design principles, manufacturing specifications, operational parameters, and most critically, the 71 facilities across Karrath space that supplied, manufactured, tested, and maintained every component. The technical picture also contained something General Shen had kept in a separate file for 18 months. The internal communications of the Karrath military faction that had authorized the weapon program and, in the final 3 months, authorized its use. One communication, written by Marshal Commander Drevel 7 weeks before the attack, estimated Terran casualties from the demonstration at 600 to 1,000 personnel and assessed this as an acceptable cost for securing a negotiating advantage that permanent border revision would provide. Another, written 4 days before the attack, noted that the Civilian Council's office had formally objected to the demonstration as an unnecessarily escalatory provocation and been overruled. They had the documentation. They had the technical picture. They had a dead director's request. Operation First and Last was authorized by unanimous vote in a session whose record would not be declassified for 17 years. It was not a fleet operation. The visible human military response, 3 warship groups repositioning to the Karrath border, was deliberate misdirection, designed to give the Karrath military something to watch, while First and Last's actual operational elements moved into position. 22 specialized assets, prepositioned over the previous 18 months throughout the supply chains feeding the Karrath weapon program. Not warships. Smaller vessels operating individually, with no visible relationship to each other or to any military force. They waited 72 hours after the attack before doing anything. The wait was deliberate. Intelligence assessments of Karrath military psychology built over 6 years consistently showed that Karrath military confidence peaked in the period immediately following a successful action and declined sharply after 48 to 72 hours without a response. A response that came immediately would be processed as expected. A response that came after 3 days of silence would arrive in a very different psychological context. At 001 on the 4th day after the attack, 22 simultaneous operations began across Karrath space. The first facility went dark at 001. By 0100, 17 had reported catastrophic system failures. By 0300, all 71 target facilities were non-operational. The Karrath weapon program, 8 years and a significant fraction of their industrial output, was functionally eliminated in 11 hours. None of the 22 assets fired a weapon. The operations involved precision disruption of power and control systems, selective destruction of irreplaceable specialized components, and targeted contamination of manufacturing processes that could not be decontaminated without rebuilding the facilities from the ground up. It was not sabotage in any conventional sense. It was surgical removal of an infrastructure that had taken nearly a decade to build, executed by assets that had spent 18 months learning every system they were about to dismantle. The survival of the Karrath Reserve Fleet was not an oversight. Admiral Marsh's operational plan had included, as one of its 3 strategic objectives, the deliberate preservation of the Karrath Collective's primary military deterrent. The targeting list had been built specifically to exclude it. Every logistics facility and research center supporting the Resonance Disruptor program had been eliminated. The reserve fleet supply depots were untouched. Its weapons had not been touched. Its personnel had not been threatened. The reasoning was in Marsh's operational briefing, written 16 months before the attack during the preparation period following the Karrath weapon program's initial detection. A destroyed reserve fleet, he had written, creates a power vacuum and a grievance. Grievances produce second shots. A reserve fleet that is intact, that has just watched its nation's offensive infrastructure eliminated without a single combat engagement, is in the possession of commanders who understand from direct experience exactly what humanity can do when it decides to act, and who now have every incentive to ensure it never has to. The Karrath Reserve Fleet was not disarmed, it was educated. Marsh opened a channel to its commander, Fleet Admiral Tivoth Soran, at 0700, 8 hours after the last target facility went dark. He transmitted a single file. The file was a targeting brief. Every Karrath military installation, economic asset, logistical node, and strategic resource that Marsh's operational assets currently held active targeting solutions for, updated in real time. The list was comprehensive and considerably longer than the 71 facilities that had been the previous night's work. "I'm showing you this for a specific reason," Marsh said in the message that accompanied the file. "We spent 8 years watching you build something you believe changed the cost calculation between our civilizations. You were right that something changed. What changed is on this list." A pause. "I'm not transmitting this as a threat. I'm transmitting it as data. If someone fires a second shot, I don't need to prepare a response. I'm already prepared. I want the officer commanding the only significant military asset the Karrath Collective currently has to understand that clearly, before anyone on your side makes a decision that requires a decision on ours." Tivoth read the file for 4 hours before responding. When his response came, it was 2 sentences. "You could have destroyed us last night. Why didn't you?" Marsh's reply was also brief. "Because we're trying to avoid the version of this where we have to." Consul Ivara Seth's private communication to her diplomatic staff, sent within hours of First and Last's completion, noted that the Terran operation had accomplished something 4 years of internal political advocacy had not. Undeniable evidence that Marshal Commander Dravel's capability demonstration had not demonstrated what he had claimed. Dravel had told the civilian leadership that the Resonance Disruptor gave the Karrath a decisive strategic advantage that justified the escalation. The Resonance Disruptor program was now eliminated without a single combat engagement. The reserve fleet, the military's own primary deterrent, had been left intact as an implicit communication that humanity had chosen restraint over annihilation. This was not the response of a civilization that had been successfully intimidated. She was preparing a formal motion to the governing assembly when Dravel's office transmitted a counter-statement through internal political channels, claiming the Terran response proved that civilian leadership had failed to maintain the deterrent posture that made demonstrations like the resonance test necessary, and calling for emergency expansion of military authority over foreign policy decisions. She forwarded it to her staff with a single note. Hold. General Shen's information operation was already in motion. The documentation release reached every major Karrath civilian information network within the same 2-hour window, through 15 separate distribution channels. The Karrath Collective's information monitoring systems were not fast enough to close any of them before the content had propagated beyond the point where closing them mattered. The timing was deliberate. Shen's operational plan had scheduled the release for the specific window following Draval's counterstatement, when that counterstatement had given the documentation a natural political context, without which it might have read as external interference rather than internal revelation. The Karrath civilian population had just watched their military leadership claim that civilian weakness had made the demonstration necessary. They were now reading simultaneously that the military leadership had planned what to do with that civilian weakness 4 months before creating the event that produced it. The documentation contained the acceptable cost communication, 600 to 1,000 Terran casualties, written 7 weeks before the attack. It contained the overruling of the Council's formal objection, and it contained a third document that no one in the Karrath political class had seen, a planning document written before the attack, outlining the political benefits Draval's faction expected to harvest from the aftermath, specifically including the argument that a civilian leadership that appeared weak in response to the demonstration would be replaceable. He had not just planned the attack. He had planned what to do with the political fallout of the attack. The document was dated 4 months before 847 people died. The political reaction was not uniform. Some defended Draval, citing the documentation's provenance as Terran intelligence output. Some demanded investigation. Some simply read the planning document and formed opinions that no subsequent political communication successfully changed. The Karrath Governing Assembly moved faster than any legislative body Shen's analysts had modeled for that scenario. Consul Seth filed her formal motion within 18 hours. The vote to open a formal investigation proceeded. The vote that followed, suspending Draval's operational authority pending that investigation, passed by a margin that was significantly closer, but it passed. Draval responded to the suspension notice with the specific fury of a man who believed he was being persecuted for being strategically correct. From his perspective, he had executed a capability demonstration that worked as designed and was being politically destroyed by a civilian class too cautious to understand what the strategic situation required. He was also, in a sense he would never have acknowledged, being destroyed by himself. Every piece of documentation Shen had released was a Karrath internal record. Human intelligence had done nothing except ensure it reached the people who were meant to govern the decisions it described. What Draval did next was the decision Shen had spent 3 months hoping to avoid and 2 months knowing was coming. The secondary platform was not part of the Resonance Disruptor program. It was an older weapons system, a conventional mass driver platform, originally deployed for asteroid defense and subsequently repurposed for orbital bombardment of surface targets, sitting in a slow orbit outside the Karrath weapon program supply chain, and therefore outside First and Last's targeting envelope. Small, old, entirely overlooked. Draval transmitted the activation order from his private office at 14:17, 42 minutes after receiving the suspension notice. Admiral Marsh received the activation alert at 14:19. He had a targeting solution within 3 minutes. He did not fire. He transmitted to Tivoth instead. Marshal Commander Draval was placed under formal arrest by Karrath Civilian Authority at 0800 the following morning, 20 hours after the platform went dark, 46 hours after First and Last completed its work, and 4 days after the weapon he had ordered used had killed 847 people who had come to a space station to map the galaxy. The arrest was authorized by the Governing Assembly in a session where no one from the military faction spoke in Draval's defense. The session's record showed 11 members who had been silent during the faction's most politically powerful weeks, now speaking at considerable length about the importance of civilian oversight of military authorization. The record did not reflect how much of their conviction was genuine and how much was the specific pragmatism of people who had read the documentation release and decided they did not want their names anywhere near what came next. Consul Seth's formal communication to the Assembly, submitted the same morning, included Admiral Marsh's written account of the final 12 minutes. The account was brief, accurate, and noted without editorial comment that Fleet Admiral Tivoth Soran had acted to prevent a strike on a civilian population with no direct authorization from any superior, and that this was consistent with the fundamental purpose of a military force, which was the protection of civilian life, and not with the orders of a political faction's representative who was under legal suspension at the time of transmission. Tivoth faced 3 separate legal proceedings over the following 8 months. All 3 reached the same conclusion through different legal arguments. His action had been lawful under the specific circumstances because Dravel's suspension had withdrawn his command authority over assets like the secondary platform. A determination that several military lawyers on both sides noted was convenient, technically sound, and almost certainly correct. He kept his command. Settlement negotiations began 6 weeks after the arrest and concluded 4 months after that, conducted by Consul Seth and Counselor Navarro through a process that required both sides to acknowledge at the outset that the conflict had produced a specific outcome. One side had fired a weapon and lost the program that built it. The other side had demonstrated a response and chosen not to use everything it had. Humanity's terms were not what the Karrath had feared. No territorial concessions, no reparations large enough to destabilize the collective economy, no demand for military reduction that would leave the Karrath defenseless against the less restrained powers along their other borders. The settlement required 4 things. First, the complete technical documentation of the resonance disruptor program transferred to Terran custody. Every specification, every design file, every test result. Second, a formal acknowledgement in the settlement's public text of what had happened at Halcyon Station, the attack, the casualty count, and the fact that the decision to conduct it had been made over the explicit objection of Karrath civilian leadership. Third, a civilian authorization commission with binding authority over Karrath military foreign policy actions, a structural change that would outlast any individual political faction. Fourth, Director Yuna Adler's name on the station rebuilt at Halcyon's coordinates, not as a memorial, as the station's name. The station would operate as before: cartographic survey, scientific research, civilian personnel, because she had believed it was worth operating, and she had been right. 10 years later, a Karrath military delegation came to tour the Terran Defense Command's strategic research facility. Admiral Marsh, retired from active fleet command but maintaining an advisory role, was asked to lead the tour. He did. The facility contained, among other things, the completed integration of the resonance disruptor technology into a deterrent architecture that had taken 8 years to develop, the same amount of time the Karrath had spent building the original program. What humanity had built from it was considerably more capable than what had destroyed Halcyon Station. It had been integrated with 19 other weapons programs in a deterrent system that the facility's strategic AI described in its operational briefings as expensive to probe. The delegation's senior member, a general who had been a junior officer during the events of 10 years earlier, looked at the coverage map for a long time. "If we had known," he said. "You had some of the pieces," Marsh said. "You didn't have all of them. No one ever does with a deterrent until it's demonstrated." He paused. "That's what makes demonstration so costly." The general looked at the display a while longer. "Would you have used all of it 10 years ago, if it had come to that?" Marsh considered the question with the care it deserved. "We didn't have to," he said. "You didn't fire a second shot." On the way out of the facility, the Karrath delegation passed through the research wing where the Resonance Disruptor's technical documentation was archived. On the wall outside the archive door there was a small plaque, a name, 2 dates, and 1 sentence. The sentence read, "She made sure." The first shot tells you something about the person who fires it. It tells you how they calculated the cost of what would follow. It tells you whether they understood what they were starting and what it would take to finish it. The Karrath Collective had calculated wrong. What humanity had made sure of in the decades since was something simpler. The next civilization that made that calculation would have considerably better data.